Good morning, and thank you for joining us for Reducing Risk, Avoiding Disaster, Creating Grid 2.0. This is a webinar for journalists and students from the Resilience Media Project at the Earth Institute of Columbia University. I'm Dale Willman. The goal of the Resilience Media Project is to help journalists in their coverage of systemic grand challenges, such as pandemics and climate risk. Right now, we do that by giving journalists tools to better cover issues surrounding these topics and to show them how to better envision stories that look towards solutions. Electric power is essential in today's world for the economic and social welfare of all Americans. And given the continuing growth of the Internet of Things, electricity demand will continue for many years to come. But as demand increases, so do the assaults to the system that delivers that energy. Wildfires in California, snowstorms in Texas, all contributed to by climate change, have shown just how vulnerable the electricity grid is in this country. The grid is a mix of connections and agreements across state lines. It uses sometimes archaic technology to survive, and its architecture is in drastic need of overhaul. So what exactly is a grid? Can we envision a new grid? And if so, what might it look like, and how do we make it resilient? And of course, how do we get there? We're going to talk about all of this today and much more, but mostly we want to hear from you, your thoughts and questions. We'll have brief presentations from our guests and then go right to your questions. Please put your questions in the chat area and we'll get to as many as we can. We have three guests today. Melissa Lott has recently been named the director of the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. Prior to that appointment, she led the center's power sector and renewables research initiative. She's also worked with the International Energy Agency. For more than 10 years, Jean Fox served as a commissioner for the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities, an organization that has, among other things, jurisdiction over electricity use in the state. While there, she became a leader among states in developing clean energy policies. She's also an adjunct at Columbia. Emily Chasen is the Director of Communications for Generate Capital, but until just a few months ago, she worked as a reporter, most recently as the Sustainable Finance Editor for Bloomberg, but also as a senior editor at the Wall Street Journal and a reporter for Reuters. Notably missing today is Jigar Shah. Jigar was going to join us, but at the last minute decided to take an appointment with the Department of Energy. He's not talking to reporters right now. So let's begin the discussion, if we could, with Jean Fox. Jean, for those of us not steeped in energy, could you give us a brief Grid 101, an explanation of what the grid is and how it works? And thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. So I'm standing in for Jigar. So the grid system is really the whole grid system we have in the country that supplies electricity. There's really three sections. There's the Western grid, west of the Rockies. There's the Eastern grid, east of the Rockies. And there's ERCOT, which is most of all of Texas, which is a unique thing we'll get to later. And so it was set up really like PJM, which is the biggest one in the country, which includes about all parts of 16, 17 states, was set up when the utilities way back in the 60s wanted to connect so they could share when there were outages, share electricity. It has expanded and expanded. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission regulates PJM and other independent system operators. They run the wholesale markets for electricity, and they're the ones that the huge transmission lines are typically, although not always, parts of that independent system operator. So it exists originally to share electricity back and forth. It now exists as is in charge of the wholesale markets. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission oversees and establishes those regional transmission organizations or independent system operators, but it's different all over the country. So we have PJM, which is big in the mid-Atlantic and into the West. You have New York ISO, you have New England ISO, you have the Midwestern ISO, but then you have other parts of the country that don't have them. ERCOT is also kind of an ISO, but it's kind of unique, and we'll get to that, the Texas one. It works well for what it was set up for, which was traditionally generation station plants, electricity generators, were part of a utility, a traditional utility. They did generation, they did transmission, they did distribution, they did the whole thing. Back in the late 90s, that was changed. So you have states now like New York, New Jersey, mostly the Northeast, Illinois, a lot of the big states, Michigan, Virginia, they all now have been restructured, it's called. But we have separated generation from distribution and transmission, so that the electric distribution company, for instance, in New Jersey, PSE&G, uh, only does transmission. They purchase their generation on a market. That happens in these restructured states. So that is a lot different than what's happening in the traditional states, which is primarily the Southeast, somewhat in the Southwest. So it's different. It's not one big system. So it's tough to regulate. So what works well is the generation going from the large generating plants, the coal plants, the natural gas plants, and others, from the generation into the huge transmission lines. It goes down to what is called substations, where that higher level electricity is ratcheted down a substation so it can go into distribution lines, which are controlled by the electric distribution companies or by the utilities in traditional states. And that goes to the homes and the businesses. So that's basically it. And that has been working well. The problem is, which is actually good news, is distributed energy resources, which is renewable energy as well as others, energy storage, and other type of things that are more the new technologies that are being used now, microgrids, et cetera, are not fitting well into the traditional grid system. And so because of climate change, because of the urgent need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuels, we are moving into distributed energy resources. And the issue is how to make them valuable part of the distribution and grid system, how to lessen the costs, because ratepayers have traditionally paid for everything that's put into a traditional utility, but also even in the restructured states, they pay for the transmission lines, et cetera, by rates that the regional transmission organization set and FERC approves. It's getting costly because we're getting to the issues of obviously reliability, but also resiliency of the grid, which is critical because of extreme weather events that are happening more and more, the California fires, Sandy, all the other hurricanes, cybersecurity, cyber tourism, which has happened, physical events and activities where other players, international players, for the most part, we think, are capable of taking out whole systems. So microgrids, et cetera, could be much more reliable, much more resilient, and we'll be getting into that. So I think that's generally it.
Talk to me just very briefly, who controls the grid? What entity is in charge of what happens with the grid?
Well, it's kind of different. That's why we're not all one system, and that's part of the problems. There's been studies we'll get to talk to briefly that the National Academies of Science have done, but we're different all over the place. And even the regional transmission organizations like New York, the PJM system, which is the Mid-Atlantic, out to Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois, and New York's ISO, New England's ISO, they all have MISO, the Midwest part. They all have different rules and different players. The PJM grid is the largest one in the country, one of the largest in the world. Certainly, it's extremely well operated, but it doesn't have a system yet. They're studying it, working with states who want to do clean energy, who want to be able to do all this clean energy that doesn't really fit into the PJM system. If you want to hook up, whether it's a new generation plant with a new transmission line because it needs, or solar or wind, like offshore wind, but there's a lot of wind in PJM, that goes into a queue, and it takes years to get through that queue. And it's a whole process, a planning process. PGA has a lot of planning, but they plan 15 years out. And the problem is states are not happy because the distributed energy resources, the new technologies are not being fit into that. So it isn't, there's nothing the same in all these different parts of the country. So they're all unique. What is common is the wholesale markets in the independent system operators are regulated by FERC. First has to approve anything they do.
But so, the idea of control, I think one of the issues is that there's no one entity, right? That if we think of the grid as this universal nationwide system, there's no one entity that controls what happens there.
Exactly. We have NERC, which is a North American Electric Reliability Council, which FERC has set up to set rules, standards for reliability of the system. And sometimes some people think that they're too strict. The issue is how reliable is reliable, and do we need 24/7 for all customers? That's one of the to have certainty 24/7 of all electricity. How much will that cost? Who pays for it? Does everybody pay for that reliable system? And then obviously the cost of resiliency is different. Resiliency is obviously, we will have outages, even though you need to try to plan and set up a system where there's not going to be outages, but there will be sometimes outages. And when there are, resiliency is getting it back up and running fast. And so that's a huge issue. There have been some National Academy of Science reports. I was on a panel on enhancing the resiliency of the nation's electricity system. That report, mandated by Congress in 2014, came out in 2017. A lot of those recommendations are still excellent. Many of them have not been followed. And there's also one that just came out last week. Same Granger Morgan, who's a distinguished professor at Carnegie Mellon, who's a friend of mine. I was on the first panel. The second panel, they just came out, The Future of Electric Power in the United States. They actually point out, I haven't read the whole thing yet, they actually point out a lot of things were recommended in the 2017 report have not yet been done. So there's a lot to do. There's a lot of people working on this important topic. The national labs that are Department of Energy labs, there's like 16 or 17 of them, but there's several of them that are excellent. So you have the National Renewable Energy Lab, which obviously does national renewable energy. And then you have Sandia National Lab, which is a national security research entity. But there's like 16 or 17 labs.
Right. And I'm going to jump in real quick so we can get to Melissa. But I think one of the things to take away from here is that there's no overall entity in control, which makes it difficult when you're talking about investment for upgrade. Who's going to take responsibility for that? Some utilities do, some do less. And who's going to make, so it makes it difficult to have an overall policy when you don't have one overriding control
Although
entity.
I note that the recent report that just came out is recommending something much more than NERC that would actually do that.
And I will point out that I sent a link to that this morning to the SCJ listserv for those of you as members of the Society of Environmental Journalists. If you're not, you should be. And that link went out, and that will also be in the resources when I put this up on our blog post. So thank you for that, Jean. Melissa, I'd like to come to you. And Jean alluded to some of these, but can you talk more about the challenges that are facing the current grid? What sorts of issues are making this such a difficult time for the grid in the U.S.?
Yeah, so I imagine that most of the people in this room don't stare at the grid as much as Jean, Emily, and I do. So I'm going to say a couple of things, and if you know this already, I apologize. I'll say it fast. I mean, when we talk about the grid, I mean, your mind can go to just the wires, right? So transmission wires, these really big things that take the electricity from power plants to closer to our homes, and then the smaller wires that we call distribution wires that actually take that electricity to our homes and to the final point of where we consume it. So homes, industrial facilities, et cetera. And so that is part of the grid. But I would say that actually we need to think about the grid. And when you think about California and Texas, it's bigger than that. So it's actually talking about power plants that put the electricity in, then the wires that move it. And there's all different types of steps there. And then the end use customers. And as Jean said, you know, part of that is folks who now are prosumers. They have solar on their rooftop. And so they're actually putting electricity into the system, not just taking it out. So when we look at that entire system and we look at these events that have happened in California, in Texas, in different parts of the country in different years, you know, none of us are immune to blackouts. Like we have them in different parts of the country. We all have different risk profiles that lead us to these blackouts, but it involves all of those pieces. One thing that is highlighted in some of the, you know, early hot takes, but this isn't a hot take, this is a fact of what happened in Texas, is that actually the grid, we need to think beyond that when we're looking at the future and how we increase reliability and resiliency in the system, and think about where the fuel comes from into that system. Because one of the things that happened within the Texas blackouts was that we actually didn't have natural gas being able to get to power plants. So even if the power plant could come on, it didn't have fuel to burn. So this is adding a layer of complexity to what Jean already touched on, is that even within the grid, we have lots of different organizations who are in charge of different pieces of it and involved in different pieces of it. But actually that grid depends on other things that are regulated by additional entities. So really, we've got a lot of disaggregated regulation and a lot of stuff that just wasn't designed to work together. And this is increasingly difficult as our infrastructure, so our power plants, our wires, our natural gas pipelines, our water treatment plants, as everything is integrated together, they're not planned in an integrated fashion. So this leads us to some challenges. So when it comes to the current state of the grid, You can go onto the American Society for Civil Engineers and see the report card they give for infrastructure. Bottom line is, spoiler alert, we're not doing so great. There are a lot of opportunities for additional investment, but we have to decide where to invest and how to invest. And really, the question comes down to the cost benefit analysis, the cost to final users, because we could invest an infinite amount of money to make the grid close to infinitely perfect and it would never go down. I'm an engineer, so it will fail at some point. There will be some situation where it will fail. But then you have infinite increases in power bills. That's the bottom line. And we don't want to do that. That has equity issues, it has practical issues. I mean, there are challenges with doing that. So we try to strike a balance where we weigh risks in the system. And one of the things that has been highlighted with the California blackouts, what's happening in Texas, but even before that, with big storms that have been happening around the country, I could go back many years. I mean, we could talk about Sandy if we wanted to, but the bottom line is our risks are changing. Our risks are changing as we go forward. And so we are in a period of time within the grid where we say, okay, we were already behind on investments and now our risk profiles are changing. So we're probably even further behind on investments, and those investments probably need to change moving forward. So those are like the big points I'd want to highlight. One of the other things I'll just mention really briefly, Dale, and then I'll pass it back to you. And if you want me to talk about anything else, I can. But there's a big reason about why we're talking about the grid, like why this is even a conversation. And the reality is, like, we depend on the grid for a lot of stuff already today. We depend on electricity to keep the economy running. And we also depend on the grid to be nearly invisible. Like, the grid is our friend when we just don't see it, except for when we're driving down the street and you might see a wire. We never want to see the grid. We just want it to give us electricity. But the reality is that entire power sector is also a major source of greenhouse gas emissions and air pollutants. And as we move forward and we look to decarbonize, if that is our goal, to decarbonize the whole system to mitigate the impacts of climate change, the electricity system has an even bigger role. So think of all those complexities. Lots of disaggregated oversight, lots of people making decisions based on, pieces of information, tapping into other organizations that are completely outside of the grid even. And then you have something that is already significant in our economy that is growing in significance as we go forward. And so the impacts of any of these blackouts, any of these risks becoming reality is only increasing over time. So this is why we're spending so much time on it. It's already it's the backbone of our economy already. And the backbone is just getting more important as we move forward. So I'll leave it there, Dale, but if you want me to touch on anything else, I'm happy to.
There's so many things that come out of that, and one of them, of course, is the old saying that politicians, at least until this last presidential election, politicians don't get elected by making promises that they're going to change the infrastructure. The infrastructure is hidden; it works well. We don't want to talk about it until it collapses, and then suddenly people are held accountable. But when you have politicians who typically don't make infrastructure a priority, as particularly things like water lines, energy systems, and you have a system that's diffused through deregulation that doesn't allow any sort of command and control structure, then it seems to be a situation rife with risk. And which brings us to the risk that you talked about, the changing risk profile when it comes to utilities. And it's something that researchers at Columbia talk a lot about now. They've got a managed retreat conference talking about risk coming up, but the idea of compound risk and the fact that things don't happen in isolation. So California may have a massive heat wave, which stresses the grid, that it might have a wildfire, which can collapse the grid, it might have an earthquake, and all these things could occur at the same time. So we need to be considering the idea of compound risk as well when we factor in these things. So I'm excited to have Emily with us. We're going to come to her in a few minutes to talk about stories that you might want to look at. So we have a journalist perspective about the stories that are here. But Emily, I just wanted to check in real quick on what you've heard so far, and if there's anything that you want to add into what we've heard.
Yeah, I think it's actually really helpful to just like pull back a little bit into that 3,000-foot view that I think journalists look at so closely, and I always try to as a journalist, and just see like what is really happening here, and why is the grid so much more important, and why would the grid cause the problems it did today? And so when I found covering sustainability for a really long time as a journalist, I found that you really had to like have a vision of where the future is going. And that was one of the reasons I joined Generate, is because we have this vision that the world is going to this decentralized, decarbonized, digitized, and democratized world, right? And that we are moving from a centrally planned sort of way we distribute energy to a much more smaller, private, cheap, efficient, democratized, decentralized system. And so you can see that really well in what's happened with wind and solar and how it's come on the grid. Like wind and solar are not produced in the same places in the world that like, you know, your centrally planned coal plants came from, right? So you actually have to like move the pieces of the grid so that they're more efficient and they connect better. And that is a place that's been really underinvested in society. We haven't really focused that much on upgrading the grid so that it can handle all this movement and change in the way we're producing electricity. And that's something we're really focused on here, as well, is that we want the grid to have like new sources of baseload power, new ways of intermittency, new decentralized tools like, you know, producing solar at your roof or having energy storage, or having microgrids that, you know, enable some sort of energy independence for people so that you can do that. I mean, even in the future, you can think years down the line that you might be able to like plug your electric car into your house and have it be a generator instead of getting a diesel generator. So there's lots of stuff that is happening here, but you kind of have to have this vision when you're writing about the space or thinking about the space, about where the world's going. And just to that point, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the risks too that we were talking about, because I think, Melissa, you brought up some really good points about how the market prices risk. And I was a financial reporter for a really long time. And what I always found was it was very hard for markets to understand climate risk, because it would be like, I guess I covered bankruptcy for a while, and there's this old like saying about bankruptcy. They asked a man, how did you go bankrupt? And he's like, oh, very slowly and then all at once, right? And that's how any crisis happens, is that it happens very slowly and then all at once. And that's exactly what happens in the climate crisis, is that you can tell if you're in Puerto Rico, you are in Hurricane Alley. You know you have a really good chance of being hit by a hurricane. But it's getting slowly more significant every year, and the hurricanes are getting slowly more stronger. So, and then they might like miss you for 3 years. They might hit Louisiana or Georgia, you know, and you don't see it because you don't know when that moment is going to be. And so for Texas, they knew after Sandy, they said, oh, you know, this pipe stuff with natural gas actually happened up in New York around Hurricane Sandy. Or sorry, not around Hurricane, I think it was around Hurricane Sandy. Something happened in New York. They're on those polar vortexes. Sorry, it wasn't that hurricane, it was a polar vortex. And it froze up there. And they said, we have to weatherize here in Texas in case it gets colder here, because what's happening with the climate is that the polar vortex is moving south. But there wasn't really the incentive, because you didn't know when that polar vortex is going to hit. And so that's sort of how we landed here today, sort of underinvestment. And there wasn't really an incentive to invest in that weatherization in the way the Texas electric grid market works. So that's sort of what I saw as a way to think about the story from like the 3,000 foot view. And I'd love to hear your questions and thoughts, and turn it back to you, Dale.
And one of the things that I think we want to get at it a little bit later is the idea of justice, because as you talk about that grand world of decentralization and electric cars being our generators, that means a lot of people are left out. So we need to talk about that aspect too, and that's I think a very important story that journalists can be looking at when they're covering these issues. So let's take, if we could, just 3 minutes each. I want to have Jean and Melissa both talk about what a resilient grid could be. We have an opportunity here in a conversation to envision what might be, rather than just saying here's what everybody's thinking, but what might be. What are the things that could make this grid resilient at a relatively cost-effective fashion that reaches everyone. So Jean, why don't you go first on that? What you see in your crystal ball? What could be?
Well, again, it's different based on the regions of the country. So Puerto Rico, which was in my region when I was at EPA for 7 years, is a different system. Most Puerto Ricans, not the visitors' hotels have air conditioning, the restaurants have, but most Puerto Ricans, there's breezes. Most of them don't have air conditioning. They want electricity for their refrigeration, for the light system, for their telephones and computers and things. And clearly, because they're going to have more and more extreme weather events, microgrids are really the way for Puerto Rico to go, because they have small, San Juan's a big area, but small communities around that island. It makes a lot of sense to do that. Since Sandy hit the East Coast, New York and New Jersey particularly hard, people in corporations, residential homeowners, they now want to be reliant. In fact, in the 90s, the military, because they need their bases operating, started to set up their own systems back then because of the necessity for resiliency and reliability. So really, there are ways to, and there have been reports done that show that distributed energy resources, if used appropriately, that can be aggregated and bid into the wholesale market for different services, ancillary services and other things, not just for capacity or energy, can actually develop a much less expensive and more resilient system for people. Again, depending on the country, but certainly in New Jersey, you could have community solar, which would be for low-income people, that actually has low-income people owning part of the system. It's a possibility. I'm trying to sell that in New Jersey, but there are other states that are working on it. California now has it where municipalities can set up their own systems. It's less expensive. But also one of the things is if a utility or a transmission company builds something, they get to rate base it, i.e. they get money for it, they get return on that rate base for the life of the product. Usually it's like 20 or 30 years, 40 years. And ratepayers pay for that. The economy is going to gradually get better, but a lot of low income, middle income people cannot afford to pay their electric bills now. That is something that regulators have to be aware of and what cost effective. And if you build a new transmission line or a new gas line, because a lot of our electricity is now based on gas generation, because since hydraulic fracturing started 10 or so years ago, that's the cheapest fuel. But Con Ed just did a thing a couple years ago in Brooklyn and Queens where they did, the state made them do alternatives to building a new gas line. And they actually did that successfully, and it cost less money for people, for the customers. So there are different ways of doing it. Unfortunately, part of the issue is the power of the existing electric distribution companies, generators, and transmission owners. And we clearly, I think everybody agrees, we still need the grid for quite a period of time. But you need to have alternatives to grids. So California had a study done by a nonprofit I'm involved in, non-wire alternatives to transmission in California's ISO. And they did 3 parts in that. There are different ways of doing it. It's less costly, and it could be actually more effective. Customers, whether it's a commercial and industrial customer or a university or whatever, they want that reliable system. They have technology need 24/7. That's one of the issues. And so they're going on to combined heat and power, microgrids, that type of thing, just because they know more extreme weather is coming up. So I really think distributed energy resources at the local level and for customers and for communities make a lot of sense. We know that electrification of buildings and of vehicles, transportation, is something we need to do because of climate change. We have a lot more electricity generated for that. So how do we do that? Who's going to pay for it? All of those issues.
I'm already hearing one story in there for journalists, the idea of non-wire transmission. I've not heard that, so that's an interesting thing to explore. So, Melissa, if you would give us just sort of your thoughts on a vision for the future. If we could, no holds barred, recreate what we're doing and make it better, what would that look like?
Yeah, no, and I'll say, like, as the director of research for the center and leading the power program, I get to work with some fantastic people, including Richard Kaufman. And when you talk, Jean, about non-wires alternatives, anybody want to know about it, let's connect you with Richard, former Energy Czar of New York, because he can give you the textbook on it about how you think through it, how you integrate.
Yeah,
stuff.
New York was the REV process, which Richard started. What they bid off everything. And we learned a lot from what New York did. But
we did.
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah.
That's the thing. Everything we do, we learn. And there's a quote from my grandfather that says, "Life is the worst teacher because it gives you the lesson or it gives you the test before the lesson." So you have the exam, and then you go, "What did we learn from?" Which is what we're doing now. So I'll say, in terms of the future of the grid, I mean, if we look towards a future where we're going, increasingly lower pollution over time, that means using more renewables, absolutely, more wind and solar involved in the system. It also includes using other low carbon resources. So if you look at the whole future system, the lowest cost transition, which gets to the equity questions you're talking about, Dale, at least partially, is a combination of things. It's variable renewables, which don't have any fuel that we have to pay for, at least. So they're really cheap when they're around. but then firm things that are around 24/7, 365. So this can be nuclear, this can be big hydro, this can be natural gas with carbon capture and storage, like these types of technologies. And then the third bucket of like a three-legged stool that gives you a really stable base where you have a reliable system is energy storage. And not just batteries, not just the Tesla Powerwall. You're going to be, if you have the money and if you have a garage for that matter, which many of us do not, you can put that in there and it gives you some hours of electricity if you need that as a backup. We're talking things that can move energy across seasons or even years. Really interesting conversations there. But when I look at the future of the system, and these are some lessons we're learning now, we think about a system that is both flexible and strong. So two words that I see being used interchangeably quite a bit are actually reliability and resiliency, and they're not the same thing. So reliability, I say it's like, okay, a reliable system is one where you can keep on trucking, and it's, you know, when a blackout happens, you know, you've fallen down. And resiliency is the ability to get back up and say, okay, I can get back up after this issue that has occurred. And it goes back to the whole thing of, I don't see a future system where we never have a blackout, but a rolling blackout for 20 minutes or 30 minutes is very different than 4 days of no electricity, which is what, you know, we lived through here in Austin, which is where I'm based. And comparing that to the 2011 cold snap, that was 4 hours versus 4 days, very different things. So in the future, I see a system where, back to, you know, Emily, you made this point talking about distributed prosumers flexibility. I see a place where we do have more demand response and flexibility. And what that means is, you know, the ability for each one of us to get paid to not demand as much electricity as we would normally demand at a certain period of time. And this is something we're going to be following. And I haven't seen a lot written about it yet, I think because we're still waiting for the data, but about like industry in Texas. In the middle of this, while I didn't have power, you know, what was industry doing? A lot of it was still on, and asking ourselves questions of, should there have been a mechanism, a stronger mechanism to pay them to not be on and to divert that electricity somewhere else? Like, could that have helped us out? And the reality, when you look at the research, that's a really cheap thing compared to building out all kinds of stuff that you don't use.
And what's that called again?
So it's called demand response.
Okay.
Yeah, demand response. So, and you at your home might do this by having a thermostat that is controlled remotely by your utility. And they say, hey, in the summer, we're going to pay you like $10 to let us cycle your air conditioner on and off for 30 minutes. But for industrial facilities, like I used to work in manufacturing, and they would pay us huge money to turn off like our 5-story tall toaster that made cornflakes. They would just pay us to turn it off because it used a lot of electricity. These type of things. That is a big bang for buck. That's like thousands of homes, but both have value. And like a home will have a local value. Those industrial facilities are like big checks that can be cashed when you can turn them off. And economically, in terms of the cost of our power, many times it is better for you to just pay someone to not use, to delay, to do your laundry tomorrow, give them a check, than to build a new power plant. Like a lot of times that is a better option when you can get that flexibility. And so I see a system where we have a lot more of that. I also see a system where we have more requirements for like minimum performance in more markets. So there's this whole discussion going on about the ERCOT market in Texas and other markets. And basically the idea of, should we pay for insurance to ensure that our power plants are going to be online in the case of an extreme event? Or do we just let the market handle it and let prices flow all over the place, which is what happened in Texas? I think that we're going to come back to a place where we say, at the end of the day, unlike other things that operate in markets, you know, power is directly related to our safety and our health. So treating it like we would apples doesn't really work. You know, we can live without an apple, but no power for 4 days, that's a problem. It's a safety issue. And so thinking about, okay, how do we actually have just a floor to say, we're going to let the market, you know, have all this freedom, but where's the floor on what we expect for anyone who's going to tell us they're going to be able to bring electricity in? I also see more integrated planning. And so these are not the sexy things, Dale. These are like the practical things that keep the lights on. So I see a system where we actually do need to coordinate more, where we do actively coordinate more, and not just within the grid, but with the fuel supply networks. We do things like in the Northeast, we'll have a power plant that normally is on natural gas, but it's got some oil on site just in case it needs to burn it. In Texas, I don't know, natural gas is like air. I think I'm quoting Cheryl LaFleur on that. We're just used to having it. So the fact that it would go away is completely unbelievable to us. Well, now it's not unbelievable because it happened, and we're going to have to, you know, get our hearts and minds around that and make some decisions as a result of that. I'll touch on two other quick things before we go on to Emily, but I'll say I see a system in the future that is really diverse. And this is something that's lost in a lot of conversations. So it's like, oh, is it centralized, huge power plants, or is it distributed? You know, I have my solar tiles on my rooftop and my storage in the garage. The reality is it's both those things, and it's well beyond solar. So diversity of fuels, every single fuel has a risk. Wind, solar, hydro, natural gas, every single one of them. The list goes on. Even nuclear went down in Texas in this freeze, okay? So given that, the idea is to understand those risks and to have a lot of different things so you don't have what I might call a single point of failure, or what many of us might call that, where one thing goes wrong and it takes everything down. It's like, well, that one thing goes wrong and I lose 20%. That's much more manageable. It's still bad, but it's much more manageable. So I see in this future, whether it's decarbonized or not, having a lot of different fuels going on. The other thing that I do think we are going to get our heads around, though, is weatherproofing. So we have, again, back to the risk profiles, we're used to saying, okay, for the past 50 years or 50 years ago, this is what things look like. Going forward, I think, Emily, you said it, the storms are getting a little stronger, a little stronger. Well, they've been doing that long enough that when we redo our risk analysis, we go, ugh, that thing that was tiny is actually not so tiny, and the impacts are massive. So this increase, that's a lot, and we're going to invest differently because of it, or we should consider investing differently because of it. So technologies, markets, regulation, like all the things, but more active consumers as a part of that. And depending on how we execute on all these things, to your point, Dale, like we will minimize equity gaps or we will exacerbate them. So if you go all distributed, you have to have a garage to put a bunch of power walls in. No offense, like some of us will do it. We want people to do it because it will give us some local, security and backup so we can be more resilient. But not everyone can do that. My apartment in Manhattan did not have a garage. I didn't have a car. Like that's not going to help me, these types of things. So we need to think about and, not or. So it's the paper versus plastic conversation. Paper, plastic, no, it's something else. It's canvas. It's another thing, or it's something that includes all of these different options. So I'll leave it there, Dale, but unless you have other questions you want me to touch on.
I just, as you were talking about weatherproofing, I was thinking of you wearing a North Face vests in Austin in March. So doing your own weatherproofing. Okay, so I want to bring Emily back in and talk for a couple of minutes about how reporters can begin looking at these things. But I want your questions too. So please start putting your questions in the chat box, because this is about the questions that you as reporters have and how these people can help you work through those questions and issues you might have. So please start putting your questions in the chat box if you would. And Emily, so hearing this, having worked in this world for a while, where do you think, you've touched on this a little bit, but where do you think the other interfaces are for reporters who are doing this, especially people who are covering from a local perspective? Where can they start looking to find stories about these issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think it starts with like your local town government and understanding what their view of resilience is and what the future of that community is. And just asking those questions could have a really big impact. Like, how are you making investments in resilience? One thing I've heard about towns is that they often don't even have the data to know where to begin to make that investment. Like, even if a lot of towns don't know like what the demand of and the amount of people in their town are on a regular basis. Like if you're a tourist town, you might not know how many people are in your town every month in the summer versus the winter, like what demands you need and like how you get that information to make sure you can flex your power system. One of the things they talked about in Texas a lot was that there's been a population influx in Texas. So in addition to everything else, there were also just more people demanding electricity. And also with COVID, there were more people demanding decentralized electricity. So those are just differences in the system. And our town set up for that. And there's lots of ways to like ask them what they're thinking about and how they can do that and how they can do that equitably. One thing, we just did this really cool project in New York at Generate called Opt Out Community Solar. And we were talking about community solar as a really interesting way to democratize access for energy, because one of the problems about the clean energy space is that the people who benefit the most from lower utility bills don't necessarily have access to the clean energy technology. And so how can we improve that system? And it might take an investment from the town, but it would really benefit all the people in the town maybe to have those lower electricity bills. I think it's also an interesting time for that in COVID, where there's all these like eviction moratoriums, to maybe have towns work with landlords and say, oh, well, we're gonna restrict you from doing evictions, but like we'll help you invest in lowering your energy bills for your tenants and upgrading your energy efficiency in your buildings. So there's a lot of potential for that and a lot of good questions you could ask around that. And just what their plans are for to decentralize energy in that town. Like maybe you can build a community microgrid. Maybe your supermarkets have microgrids. How do you know that your essential businesses are getting the right kind of access? One thing that Melissa brought up a little bit about Texas is like some of the industrial customers were going on. Well, some of them had access to like a totally different grid than people in their houses have access to, and a totally different gas flow. and pipeline. And that might be why that was successful. So you have to sort of like look and understand the map of energy choices available in your town, where the options are, like what the needs of your town are. There's a lot of questions that I don't think public officials have gotten through yet. We were working with a town the other week that said, hey, we want to start figuring out how to convert our school buses to electric buses. And, you know, just very basic questions about like, who even does this? Who provides an electric bus? How do you lease an electric bus? How do you get the electricity from the utility to charge the electric bus? What if I have to do that contract? Like all the little things you put in that system. And it's interesting about like electric buses and like electrification generally, because you know, like there's so many health benefits to that too. One thing we don't talk about as much in the clean energy transition is the immense health benefits of electrification of buses and, you know, like diesel tools in factories, and like how that improves people's lives because you don't have the exposure to fossil fuels in that way. So lots of things there to think about. Hope that was helpful as a way to start thinking
great.
about stories you could ask. But
there's one that fascinates me here, and they all fascinate me, but one that their data journalism and visual journalism is something that we're seeing more and more of, and the idea of simply understanding the energy sources in your town and where they're coming from could create a map. It could create a lot of other things that I love explanatory journalism and the opportunity to say, hey, these are where your sources come from. Here are the vulnerabilities involved. Here are the problems that they're faced by that. So that's an interesting way of looking at it. So we're getting some questions, and I'd like to get to the questions, but thank you, Emma. That's a great list of things that people
just one note on that really quick,
Yep.
Dale, is I remember this story I looked at a while ago where in Puerto Rico there is a power plant like just a mile from the beach, and you're like, oh, is that really where you want to put a power plant in Puerto Rico these days? You know, like stuff like that. That map is a really great idea for, I think, all journalists to look at in their town.
Yeah, Puerto Rico really has a lot to work on.
All right, so let's go to Nano Riley. Hi, Nano. How reliable are microgrids, and how would one start one? And if you would give a definition of a microgrid first of all. I don't know which one of you wants to address
there are
that.
different types of microgrids. So during Sandy, Princeton University, parts of Rutgers University, and a couple other places in New Jersey continued to operate because they had microgrids. Princeton was combined heat and power. Luckily, the students were off, but they didn't lose any of the lab tests. I mean, you got all those little critters and things that they have. That all went. Rutgers kept their little lab critters and stuff alive because they had microgrids. And what they do is they use their system during the current crisis with no crisis into selling to PJM. So they make money off of producing electricity and sending into the grid. And then when they need it, they could actually operate the most crucial parts of their system. In New Jersey, we've been doing that now. There's a pilot, they're going into full time now, having community microgrids in towns. And I envision most of the towns and cities having a community microgrid where the emergency responders, the fire department, the police department, some kind of structure that could be community housing where people could go, or a community structure where people could go to stay warm and to charge their phones and all that kind of stuff. I think that's going to happen. It's something that is important. And that's with community microgrids and community solar, because not everybody can have solar.
Briefly, how would one set one up? How do one of these get set up? And we've got a lot of questions, so I want to try and...
Well, yeah. I mean, you set it up working with in New Jersey would be with the Utility Commission, but I'm sure that NYSERDA in New York and other places, they know how to do this. New York is doing this now. And other states are working into it. Community, and then when you have a problem with the transmission line, with the major grid system going down, they can separate and operate continually, like parts of New Jersey, Princeton, and Rutgers did during Sandy.
Yeah, we sell microgrids at Generate, so we have a lot of people who we work with on that in cities and towns. And I would just say that there's lots of different kinds, like yes. Natural gas microgrids or solar plus storage, or some of the ones that Gina described are, there's a variety. But what you want to think about microgrids is actually something that's providing extra baseload power. in the system. So it's like we're providing extra and independent reliability, and sometimes much more efficiently than the stuff that comes from the natural gas pipeline, even if it is natural gas. So some people worry that microgrids are dirty, and maybe they will say that that's the reason that it can't do it, but they actually are not. They're usually cleaner than what the current system is. And then also they have the option sometimes in the future, maybe there will be like hydrogen pumped into those microgrids. So there's a lot more chances for them to become cleaner over time.
And they don't have the transmission loss of electricity over the transmission lines, which you completely
over long
have.
distances, right? So and after Hurricane Sandy, that bright spot in Lower Manhattan was NYU and their ability to create electricity for the hospital down there because of their system that they had in place. And this is a resilience issue too. Microgrids can fit into resilience more. So question from Annie. Hi, Annie. It's nice to see you. I cover ISO New England, where we have a really high reserve margin for fear of blackouts and high winter demand. Some climate activists and grid modernization hawks think this approach inflates rates and keeps old fossil fuel peaker plants online unnecessarily.
Yes.
Are there successful models in other regions that take a different approach to reliability? Do you think this sounds the same as resiliency? Melissa, could you want to respond to that?
So when we talk about that, I mean, reserve margins are the focus of like hot debate everywhere. So step one in all markets, it's like how much extra stuff do we need around? And this goes back to risk. And to say, okay, is there a validity in that thought that, okay, this is actually inflating rates and keeping things aligned? The question is, okay, well, what are our actual risks? And reevaluating the risks that we talked earlier. In some systems, I mean, we did an extreme case in ERCOT, and guess what? It wasn't close to what we needed at the end of the day. What I will say in that case is the argument doesn't hold up because we didn't have a capacity shortfall. Like we had a bunch of power plants around, we just couldn't turn them on. That was the problem. So a reserve margin would not have helped us because we just wouldn't still have been able to turn on. But what else?
Okay.
I was going to say really quickly, when it comes to resiliency, it's more like a reliability standpoint, but it does contribute to resiliency too. Having facilities around that, worst case scenario, you can turn them on and they may be dirty for that moment, but that's still going to be a lot healthier for people than not having power. There is plenty of public health literature out there to support that. Now, you always try not to turn it on, but at the end of the day, if you're in the middle of a heat wave, and you have a beautiful cat. Sorry, it's my favorite thing about Zoom is seeing people, the animals and children run around. I love it.
Like
but
5 seconds, my video's on. Sorry, thank you.
No, and sorry, I shouldn't have mentioned it. I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but I love that genuinely. I know all of the cats in our office now, which is fantastic. But I'll say, like, when it comes to resiliency and reliability, there is a lot of value that can help you keep rates low by keeping resources that you've already invested in. Instead of retiring them, shift the business model under which they run. You've already spent a ton of money, and so you don't have to reinvest in that again. You already have it, so use it differently, and that can help you to keep rates low. In terms of successful models, I think there are different models that all have trade-offs. They all have trade-offs in how you actually give reliability. And you can look within the US, which I think goes into David's question as well, or you can go global. You can look at the UK market. New Zealand, if you want to nerd out on electricity, New Zealand is actually one of my favorite places to go because 70% of their power comes from hydroelectric power. A bunch of it's geothermal. They've got natural gas. They've got some coal, but they have to import it. And it's all on these islands. So it's very contained and you can study a lot of stuff. I'll say, each one of the trade-offs. So do we pay for capacity? Do we pay for these huge reserve margins? Do we not? They just have different risks. And so that's the thing. The question that I would ask, and when I talk to different reporters in every single interview I say is like, this entire conversation almost all the time is about trade-offs. You're accepting a certain set of trade-offs, but there are always trade-offs and risks. And so what I would say is if anyone talks to you and they aren't talking on both sides of that, like the pluses and minuses and the risks and the costs and benefits, like you poke at the side they're not discussing and you'll learn a lot about it. Or they won't say anything and you learn something from that too. That's right, my quick feedback.
And I should have jumped in earlier to see if you had anything to add to the whole microgrid conversation too.
I'll just say, Nana, to the second half of your question, or the first half about how reliable it is, it purely depends on the same decisions that we make at a big scale, which you make at a micro scale. So within your microgrid, you may design it to be able to say it's a solar plus storage, like Emily said, system. And we're going to have storage that actually can carry you through, so that reliably, most of the time you'll have like a day's worth of continuous power. So on kind of normal days, in the summer when there's no thunderstorms, you'll be totally fine. And then you'll depend on the grid for the rest of it, versus like at UT Austin, they have a combined heat and power facility. They can just island themselves and they can sell electricity out. So they design it differently. And each one has a cost and benefit. For a community, often you don't want to design yourself to be able to completely take yourself out of the grid all the time, because it is expensive, and it's cheaper because you already have a connection to a major grid to do it that way. If you're building from scratch though, you would spend more on having more reliable equipment. So the reliability, it's the same equation that we talk about at a big centralized scale. How much are you willing to pay to reduce your risk of things going dark on different days? And I'll say in that, like, resources very much vary, not just by day, but by seasons. And this is something we get into a lot, where you say, I can say the sun came up and the sun came down, but we all know the sun is not as strong every single day as it is other days. So that's something that is factored into those reliability things. That's all I wanted to add, Dale. Just the reliability question is a really good one.
Thanks.
That was a really good point about seasonality, Melissa. Just that, like, I felt like we were talking about Texas, and the Texas grid is so built for that high summer AC season, and not so built for the very cold polar vortex season. So, well,
in fact, some of the power generators were offline to repair and stuff, because they weren't expecting that kind of.
Yeah. I mean, I
people will say, why on it? Oh, go ahead.
Backup systems, hospitals, places of necessity have backup systems. But frequently what happened during Sandy, during a lot of these places, is you have to contain and maintain those systems. Frequently, they don't work because people haven't maintained them. That's a big problem. I also wanted to mention in Texas, I mean, they've had polar vortex situations before. In 2011, I think, and 2014, there were reports and studies done of what Texas could do to lessen that risk. They didn't do that in Texas. They could have insulated things like we do in other parts of the country where it's colder. They didn't do that almost routinely, because it would cost, even for, although it was not the wind turbines, it was the fossil fuel facilities, really. The wind turbines could spend, I think it was $1,600 or $1,900 to do something with them that make it less likely to go down and freeze. Same thing with insulation of pipes, that kind of thing that Texas knew they could have done. It was in a report that was put out maybe 6 years ago. They didn't do it. So which is why this new report coming out of the National Academy of Science said we need to have a federal independent entity responsible for leading investigations on blackouts and getting key lessons learned from that. And that's what this most recent report is recommending, because we have NERC, but that's different. You have
key lessons don't matter if there's no one to enforce responding to them. And your point about backup power, up here in upstate New York where I am, the hospitals have generators, but of course, even if they are maintained and even if they are tested properly, you only have a limited amount of gas there to run the generators, or diesel, or whatever they might run on. And if it's an event that lasts for a considerable amount of time, that problem still exists.
Well, also another issue is for energy storage. We really should be spending a lot more research on energy storage, thank God for Tesla. But for homeowners, there's Sunrun, which is one of the big national solar companies. They have been for 2 or 3 years now installing solar and commercial and residential roofs with energy storage. Now, the energy storage will keep you going for maybe 6 hours, but if you don't use, you only want to use your electric for the refrigerator and for your lighting and for charging, you could go much longer. Yeah, and that's what people now are thinking about. Customers are driving this. They know corporations are residential. They know that more extreme weather is going to occur. They don't want to be down for 6 days. I'm 2 blocks from a hospital. First time in my life in New Brunswick, New Jersey, we were down for 6 days for Sandy. Luckily, my neighbor had a diesel generator. Anyhow, but now I have solar. I want to get this energy storage with a smart inverter in there. So the next day when it's sunny, I have electricity. A lot of people are like that.
And we need to say goodbye to Melissa because she has another meeting, because this is what we do now. But thank you for spending so much time. Yes,
I appreciate it. I'll say 30 seconds. One thing that I think has been wonderful that I've started to see in the stories coming out about Texas is 2011, everyone's been focused on that because that was a big deal, not compared to this year, but it was a big deal and it was only 10 years ago. There's some great quotes that journalists have uncovered from 1975 and 1989 as well, talking about these same issues. And so what that does is it allows them to really dig into in conversation saying, why haven't we responded? If we can go all the way back to 75, like we've known the risks, why haven't we responded? Because there are reasons why we haven't made different choices. And so that's great. But Dale, thanks again for the invite. You guys have a good day.
And we've got 2 more quick questions. Melissa, thank you so much. And we have 2 more questions we'll get to, and then we'll let people run. David, we'll get back to yours a little bit more. We touched on it briefly, but I want to get to one other one quickly, which is the idea of a number of states, New York, Vermont, Maine, New England states, New Hampshire at one point, have been looking to import from Quebec hydro to clean up their grids. And does that make sense? So, Jean, if you want to address that, and Emily, I don't know if that's something you could respond to or not. But
yeah, hydro is energy storage. Hydro is done in different places. TVA has it up in the Northwest of the US. They have it. We can't do much more hydro in this country because of the environmental impacts or the ecosystems or those rivers. But New York has a lot of hydro up there, and they bring it down. Some gets to the city. Actually, New Jersey gets a little piece of it, technically. Hydro is a great thing to do. Problem with the hydro in New York State is the transmission lines needed to put down into the lower part of the state where the population is. People don't like transmission lines. So that's an issue. Hydro is a great benefit. There is small hydro that places are starting to use. New York City is looking at it in the rivers around New York, but it's small hydro. The large hydro, we're not going to see much more of it in this country. I think we'll be seeing it in other countries, but you got to flood a lot of people and a lot of property out if you do that.
there are huge environmental costs for large hydro, and
I
that's one of the huge issues.
TVA wouldn't probably happen the way it happened, nor would
Not today.
In Northwest. Yeah, no.
Emily, anything to add to that?
Just a couple notes. I saw actually Bloomberg New Energy Finance had a nice piece today about wave technology and using wave power as a potential thing. That's not quite hydro, but just building little
it's called a power
on the
buoy.
ocean.
Yeah, there's a power buoy. And geez, we had that tested off the coast of New Jersey in a couple locations. And what's good about that is with offshore wind, the power buoys only go about 15 feet above water. So there's continual wave action. So even with offshore wind, which will be huge for off the coast of the Atlantic, certainly into the future, probably half of our electricity for New Jersey and other states, Maryland, will come from that. But you could put the power buoys in between. It is effective, though, off of coast of, say, the North Sea, where they have a lot more energy, or the Pacific Northwest, where the Pacific Ocean has a lot more. So wave action, it's really very useful, and it gets obviously stronger sometimes than not, but it's always there. And so that definitely is the future too.
Yeah,
so
and I've seen floating solar is really interesting too. And just the last thing I was going to say was somebody asked about where there are other examples of grid stuff, and I think the European grid is really instructive and interesting. And my favorite story about the European grid is that, when it's really hot in summer in Portugal, they just have a ton of electricity from their wind and their solar, and they sell it all to the rest of Europe. And in the US, we have the Sunshine State in Florida, and they don't have that option. So that's just something that we should be thinking about too, as using grid as an example.
We have 2 more questions, and then we'll wrap things up. I want to get to David and to Adam, but I also want to just point out that we don't always have to reinvent things. I was driving in Western Pennsylvania once and came upon this really odd structure that I looked up, and it was it's been around, I forget, since the 50s or something, and it's by a river. And at night, the hydro plant there with a small dam, when energy demand is low, they pump the water up into a reservoir up on the mountain. And during the day, when energy demand is high, they bring the water back down to increase their capacity. So there's a battery, in a sense, that's a capacity of storage that we don't always have to reinvent and come up with brand new technology.
That was proposed in New Jersey in the late 80s when I was director of the Water Division and Utility Commission. Someone actually proposed to do that in Northwest Jersey.
So it works really well. So
also, geothermal is really something we need to do a lot more in this country, as well as heat pumps. Heat pumps are something we really need to do.
So we've got two questions, if we can answer them quickly because we're over time, but I want to get to these. David, we talked a bit about this, but is there a country that's done the grid right or better? How and why? What aspects? And how do we compare to other grids around the world? You also mentioned being in China 10 years ago, near every apartment had big individual solar water heaters on the roof. So maybe there are folks without a garage can participate in distributed systems. So Jean, do you have any quick comments to that, to the other countries and who does it well that we can
we are learning from Europe and actually from California a lot, the rest of the states. And so they've gone first in a lot of things. So we're learning from them. There's a lot of information out there and the different organizations that put that information together. So we've learned a lot about that. There's no one who have done it right. Offshore wind, we learned Germany blew some stuff on wind, so we learned from what they did wrong. UK is doing some really good things on that. Solar has been done differently. New Jersey and California were the leaders when I was involved, maybe 10, 15 years ago, started the solar renewable energy credit, which we didn't have before that. So you have to learn best practices is important. And so what you need to do is there are different people, academics, et cetera, putting together best practices as well as some other energy organizations.
Okay, Emily?
Yeah, I'd say, other parts of the world have a broader view of like what you can use to create energy as well. So like another area where Europe is ahead of us is on food waste digesters, yes. Which you can, instead of sending food waste to a landfill like we do in most places in America, they send it to a organic digester, and it's sort of like a big beer tank that like ferments it and it creates this gas, and you capture that gas and you create electricity from that and sell it into the grid. And in Europe, you'll find it just in the middle of the city. There will be a food waste digester that handles all of that. And we actually waste 40% of the food in America. So that is another way to sort of create baseload power that can be more creative and have some multiple impacts.
And there are people trying that in the United States. One of the problems is that public service tried to do it, in New Jersey 10, 15 years ago. But you have to have consistency of the waste product. And if it's not basically the same consistency, the gas will not be the way it needs to be able to burn correctly for most uses of that natural gas. So public service stopped doing that after a couple of years. So Europe, that's another thing we can learn from Europe on. They've done some things really well.
Same problem with trash burning power plants is that
yes, exactly.
You want to reduce the amount of trash that you have, but you need to increase it to have a supply to power the plants. In turkey farms around the Great Lakes, they actually are using biodigesters with the turkey manure as well to generate electricity for their local operations, which is a very interesting because they have a regular feeder stock for those plants. All right, so the last question, I think this is a good one to end on from Adam. I'm interested in the challenges related to transitioning away from legacy plants. Is there any path for coal plants to be refueled or retrofitted? And what's the afterlife of those sites, given that they're well connected, sometimes near demand loads? So I think it's a good transition from old to new.
Carbon capture and sequestration and other uses for carbon is being studied. Past administrations have put money into that. I think the right administration is going to continue with that. The problem with coal is it really is dirty, and fossil fuel it has problems. So even gas is the transition fuel. That very few uses will be that after like 2030, 2040, maybe to melt aluminum, steel, other type of productions where you need that. But the coal plants, unless they're newer coal plants, in this country, there are very few newer coal plants, you're going to get other pollutants like NOx, SOx, things that are bad for asthma, that particulate matter, that kind of thing, not good for human health. I think most experts know the coal plants have to shut down. Natural gas plants will continue. Now, PJM still has coal plants, but because of the carbon emissions, it's really bad stuff. Natural gas plants, a lot less in emissions, although hydraulic fracturing, which is now where we get it from in our country for the last 10 years, there are a lot of issues and studies I think being done now on the greenhouse gas emissions from actually extracting that natural gas. But natural
gas, no transitional coal, those things have to be shut down eventually, but no transitional.
Well, I think they're working on carbon capture and storage. So for some of the newer facilities, yeah. But
that's likely a long time away, though. But so and the point that he makes there, I think, is critical, is that these are located near high demand areas often. So it has an advantage of location, that if it could be retrofitted, but if there's no concept or no way of doing that, then it doesn't make sense.
And natural gas is actually cheaper, as is wind, is cheaper, not offshore wind, but terrestrial wind. It's much cheaper than coal. And in Texas, coal froze. I mean, it actually froze in Texas. So coal, it'll be kept around for a while. In some places, it's going to go away. It's got to go away. It's just too dirty.
Emily, anything you want to add?
I just think you see a lot of like just in those specific places where grid connectivity is versus the coal, you see coal to gas switching, and that's increased over the past few years. It probably will continue to increase. But also one way to even think about that too is that actually some of our wind farms are getting older now and have grid connectivity, and even those need to be replaced and can become more efficient. So there's like lots of innovative ways to improve the grid, and I think we covered a really good range of technologies here today.
Great. All right. So now, if you all bear with me for one quick second, I want to just wrap up here, but I want to thank you all for joining us. I want to give my thanks to Melissa, Jean, and Emily for being here. Also, a quick process note for the journalists here. A video of this webinar will be posted in the next few days at the Earth Institute blog called State of the Planet. The address is blogs.ei.columbia.edu. That's blogs.ei.columbia.edu. Along with the video, I'll include a blog post, and there will be links to resources along with story ideas you can use to begin your coverage of this issue. I hope you'll check it out and also look at the other videos that make up the Resilience Media Project. The Resilience Media Project is a part of Andy Revkin's initiative at the Earth Institute called Sustain What. Sustain What is a global conversation focused on identifying concrete solutions to the complicated challenges of humanity today. Our primary focus is on making sense of the changes impacting our Earth and biological systems. In light of the outbreak of COVID-19, the main focus of our sessions is on mitigating the unfolding societal disruption and devastation driven by this pandemic, and teaching journalists how to better respond to those issues. At the same time, we're also focusing on ways to build more resilient, inclusive, and sustainable communities in the years ahead. You can check out Andy's program as well as mine at the Earth Institute website. And again, my thanks to all of our guests and to you for joining us. I look forward to seeing you again at a future program. Thanks, everybody.